Almighty God, we give thanks to you, the creator of the universe, and humbly beseech you to direct and prosper the deliberations of the members of this house here assembled for the advancement of your glory and the truth and the trust and welfare of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Grant that peace and happiness, truth and justice may be established among us for all generations. Amen.
Oath or affirmation, announcements by the Deputy Speaker.
Honorable members, I have received communication from Mrs. Glenda Jennings-Smith, MP, member for Toko Sandy Grande, who has requested leave of absence from today's sitting of the House. The leave which the member seeks is granted.
Bills brought from the Senate: the Interception of Communications Amendment Bill 2020 in the name of the Attorney General. Petitions, papers.
Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I have the honor to lay the report of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Office of Procurement Regulation for the year ended September 30th, 2019. I beg to move, that paper 1 be referred to the Public Accounts Committee.
Honorable members, the question is that paper 1 be referred to the Public Accounts Committee. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it.
Reports from committees.
I call on the member for Kumuto Manzelina.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have the honor to present the 13th report of the Joint Select Committee on Social Services and Public Administration, 5th Session, 11th Parliament, on an inquiry into the prevalence of teenage pregnancy and the state's capacity to minimize the occurrence of teenage pregnancy and provide services to teenage pregnant parents.
Prime Minister's questions.
Member for Tabakit.
Could the Acting Prime Minister state whether the government is taking any special measures to monitor cargo, as well as ships, including fishing vessels and their crew arriving from China, Japan, and Korea?
Honorable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In addition to existing travel restrictions for persons traveling within 14 days from the countries that have so far been identified, and thermal scanning, the government has also implemented enhanced surveillance measures at our seaports and airports. These include passenger and crew manifests with more information giving full travel history for passengers and crew to allow us to determine the risk of exposure. Details of the last 10 port of calls have also been required. The Maritime Services Division has also communicated to captains to do active surveillance aboard ships. This is in addition to the regular maritime declaration of health, which is incumbent upon vessels and captains of vessels.
Supplemental, member for Tabakit.
Mr. Acting Prime Minister, do you have any port health officials going on the boats to do either visual or using equipment to do some kind of testing on a random basis, despite what might be communicated to you by the ship captain or what have you?
Honorable Prime Minister.
I'm advised by the Minister of Health that this is happening. Port health officers are visiting vessels to conduct additional surveillance.
Supplemental again, Member for Tapkid.
Are they doing so on the visits? Are they just doing a visual observation, or are they using equipment to randomly test people?
Prime Minister.
Is by the Minister of Health that they are currently looking at the declarations submitted by the captains and also interviewing the captains and the ship's officers. Doctors, I apologize, doctors.
I recognize the member for Carney East.
Honorable Acting Prime Minister, what's the position of the government on the passenger cruise ships in terms of allowing passengers to disembark or refusing their admission into our seaports?
Acting Prime Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, this question asked about cargo, fishing vessels, and crew. I would not want to make any definitive statement about cruise ship vessels at this time. I am sure that that question can be posed in due course, but I would not want to speak out of turn because the question posed to the Prime Minister speaks to cargo and fishing vessels and crew.
Carney East.
Honorable Deputy Speaker, Honorable Acting Prime Minister, you would see the question says cargo as well as ships. And that's in that context I ask you about passenger ships. And you're evading the question.
Member for Couva North. Next question.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Question number 2. Given there's a shortage of N95 masks, could the acting Prime Minister indicate why the government sent 13,000, that's a typo, Mr. Deputy Speaker, not 35,000, 13,000 it's supposed to be, 13,000 N95 masks to China?
Honorable Acting Prime Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm advised that the question is based on a false premise. It was not the government that sent that donation of masks to China. It was the private sector. So the question is based on a false premise. However, I'm advised by the Minister of Health that there is no shortage of N95 masks in the public sector. And I want to repeat that the 13,000 masks were sent by the private sector, not the government.
Supplemental member.
Minister, are you aware that it is your Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister Dennis Moses, who made that statement to the media where he said 13,000 N95 masks were sent to China to help?
Prime Minister. Prime Minister, please.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I don't know why the member wants to ask and answer the question. The fact of the matter is that there is no statement by any government minister that the government sent masks to China. The fact of the matter is masks were sent, and they were sent by the private sector.
Supplemental member for Couva North.
Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, are you aware in an article dated Wednesday, February the 12th, 2020, a Guardian article, Minister Dennis Moses was quoted as saying 13,600 masks were sent to China to help combat the COVID virus?
Well, again, Honorable Prime Minister. Acting.
Firstly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there's no such post as Deputy Prime Minister. So I'm not the Deputy Prime Minister. And secondly, that comment made by the Honourable Member refers to a newspaper article which may or may not be accurate, but even, let's assume it is, that does not indicate that the government sent the masks. And I want to reiterate my information that the masks were sent by the private sector.
You can't stop that. Why? You can't understand that? No, he didn't.
I recognize the member for Carney East.
Honorable Acting Prime Minister, in your statement a while ago that the state could be assured that there's no shortage of these masks, could you give an indication to the House what is the quantity that you may have available for use by healthcare personnel and workers altogether?
Acting Prime Minister.
Firstly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I didn't say any of the things that the honourable member said I said. I said there is no shortage in the public sector. I find this a little strange what is happening today. The member for Cuba South clearly is aware that the Minister of Foreign Affairs referred to a shipment of masks, not a government shipment, but mixing up. And now the member for Caroni East, or whatever it is now putting words in my mouth. I want to repeat, I have been advised by the member for St. Joseph, the Honorable Minister of Health, there is no shortage of masks in the public sector. I'm advised by the Minister of Health, there are 23,000 masks in stock and 25,000 additional masks are on their way and are expected to arrive in Trinidad and Tobago within the next week or so.
Supplemental, Caroni East.
When you say in stock, Acting Prime Minister, is it held by the Ministry of Health and given to the regional health authorities, or where is it stockpiled?
I wouldn't entertain that question at this time. You could use otherwise. Member for Tabakit.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Could the Honourable Acting Prime Minister state what specific checks for the coronavirus are being done and by whom on persons arriving at Cedras as well as Chagaramas and Brighton ports?
Acting Prime Minister.
The enhanced surveillance that I referred to in the answer to the first question, which include examination of the passenger and crew manifest, examining the full travel history of passengers and crew, and also visits by Port Health to the vessels, examination of the declarations made by the captain, interviews with the ship's doctors, and so on. All of those enhanced surveillance measures are in place at all legal ports of entry.
Supplemental, Tabakit.
Prime Minister, absolutely and unequivocally certain that there's Port Health Authority, for example, in Cedras, and that checks are being done in Cedras, even with respect to the boats that are arriving from Venezuela with scrap iron?
Acting Prime Minister.
I can only go on what I'm told by the relevant officials. I have to report what is told to me by the Minister of Health, Minister of National Security, and so on.
Supplemental for Naprimo.
Thank you. Could the Minister then indicate how many vessels have been checked at Cedras over the past 72 hours and by whom?
Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I have not yet developed those superhuman powers of detection, but I will get the answer.
Member for Tabakit, you have a supplemental again? Member for Tabakit.
My question asked, by whom were the checks being done? Is the Acting Prime Minister aware that this CMOH for Superior, in the Superior Regional Cooperation area, had asked for quarters at Cedras in order to house persons to do checks, and that those quarters were not provided, and therefore there are no personnel from the CMOH doing checks in Cedras?
And the question is?
The Acting Prime Minister aware?
Honourable Prime Minister, acting.
I think it's a bit of a stretch, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to expect me to be aware of that. I'm not aware.
Member for Princestown.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, through you to the Acting Prime Minister. Could the Acting Prime Minister indicate whether the Cabinet has considered establishing an interministerial committee to address specific plans related to treating with coronavirus, now COVID-19, should it reach our shores?
Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Yes, as already announced by the Minister of Health, a ministerial or interministerial committee has been appointed. The committee is chaired by the Chief Medical Officer and includes representatives from various arms of national security, the protective services, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Social Development, Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Finance, Maritime Services Division, the Airports Authority, Civil Aviation Authority, Port Authority, the Tobago House of Assembly, the ODPM, and TIMA. And the committee has already held its first meeting on the 5th of March.
Supplemental member for Princestown.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Through you to the Honourable Acting Prime Minister. Prime Minister, could you indicate whether or not it is the remit of the committee to start engaging stakeholders with respect to consultations on pursuing matters related to being prepared in anticipating whether or not the coronavirus reaches our shores in terms of stakeholder consultations?
I'm advised by the Minister of Health, yes, of course. That will be done.
I recognize Carine East. Princestown, you'll give way? Okay. Carine East, I recognize.
Honourable Prime Minister, is there any active consideration by the government or the Ministry of Health to appoint a point person who will indicate to the country on a daily basis, on a regular basis if needed, what's the situation of the country in relation to the coronavirus?
Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. As has occurred over the last several days, the official spokesmen and point persons, if you want to use that terminology, with respect to this issue, are the Honourable Minister of Health and the Chief Medical Officer, both of whom have been authorized and are making official statements with respect to the coronavirus situation on a daily basis, and also taking responsibility for coordination and action with respect to coronavirus.
Supplemental, Carine East, member.
Acting Prime Minister indicate to the country, as far as the coronavirus testing is concerned, whether the Ministry of Health has taken into consideration any other areas other than CAFA for the testing of the coronavirus, any other laboratories.
Honourable Prime Minister acting.
I'm advised by the Minister of Health that at this time, CAFA is the only reference laboratory for the testing for the coronavirus. Even for the private sector. It's the only reference laboratory that is, I'm hearing it could be for other Caribbean countries as well. But in Trinidad and Tobago, it is the only reference laboratory that is authorized and accredited, if you want to use that terminology, to test for the coronavirus. And CAFA, for those who don't know, because I get this question all the time, where is CAFA? CAFA is at 16 to 18 Federation Park in Port of Spain.
Supplemental, Carine East.
Be allowed, Acting Prime Minister, would the Honourable Prime Minister indicate to the country what is the capacity and the efficiency of CAF to do these testing? Approximately how much could be done per day in case there is a surge of testing required?
Acting Prime Minister.
I am advised by the Honourable Minister of Health that so far, based on the caseload at this time, the turnaround time is 4 hours.
Member for Couva South. Next question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Could the Acting Prime Minister state the purpose of the Prime Minister's current trip to Ghana, as well as the persons comprising the official delegation?
Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Honourable Prime Minister, Dr. Keith Christopher Rowley, and also member for Dega Martin West, was invited to be the special guest of honor at the 63rd Independence Celebrations of Ghana. This is a very high, esteemed honor and was accepted by the Honourable Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is also using this opportunity to pursue a number of collaborative arrangements with Ghana such as an air service agreement and potential expansion of opportunities for partnership in the energy sector, the agriculture sector, the financial services sector, and trade. The delegation includes Mrs. Rowley, the Minister of Public Utilities and his spouse, Dr. Aline, advisor to the Prime Minister on matters of agriculture, security officers, the press secretary, and a videographer.
Supplemental, Couva South.
Could the acting Prime Minister inform this House what is the financial cost to the taxpayers of Trinidad and Tobago, inclusive of support staff?
I will not entertain that question. Supplemental, Naprimo, proceed.
Could the acting Prime Minister indicate why no technical staff expertise were part of the mission to inform the discussions that took place? Or is it another situation like occurred in Houston last year that created?
Member, which question would you like to be answered?
No technical support staff accompanied, given this level of discussions and the areas of discussion?
Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The member for Naparima is approaching the age which was a subject of query by the member for Oropouche West, and therefore should know, because I don't buy the argument of the member for Oropouche West that as you approach the age of 70, you have some intellectual faculty problems. I don't buy that argument. But the member for Naparima is approaching the age of 70, and therefore should be very familiar with the esteemed Dr. John Aline, a renowned agriculturalist and technical expert in agriculture. And I just called his name, Dr. Aline, advisor to the Prime Minister on matters of agriculture. I want to repeat, Dr. Aline is a distinguished technical expert in agriculture, world-renowned.
Supplemental, member for Naprimo.
Is the acting Prime Minister aware that I am younger than his Prime Minister, his boss, to whom he reports? And the question is, give us, since energy matters was a significant component of the discussions, what does an agricultural expert have to do with the energy matters that are critical to this economy?
Acting Prime Minister.
Allow me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to correct the record. What I find today is that members opposite are making up their own reality. I never said that energy was a major component of the visit. What I said is that the Prime Minister is taking the opportunity, whilst in Ghana, to be the guest of honor at the 63rd anniversary celebrations of Ghana, which is a distinct honor. While he's there, accepting that honor, he's taking the opportunity to explore cooperative and collaborative arrangements in a number of areas, and I listed them: agriculture, financial services, trade, and energy. At no time did I say a major thrust of the Prime Minister's visit was to deal with matters relating to energy. What I want to repeat is that the Prime Minister has specifically taken Dr. John Aline, advisor on agriculture. And if the honourable member was reading the newspapers, he would see that there's already been a news report that Trinidad and Tobago is to benefit from a new stock of ground provision from Ghana, which is clearly as a result of the technical assistance provided by Dr. John Aline.
Member for Naprima.
Given the wide range of areas discussed and the fact that we ran into problems with respect to bad negotiations in Houston last year, why only in agriculture do we have the necessary expertise, and why not the other areas that are also important?
I will not entertain that question. Member for Couva South.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Acting Prime Minister, given the presence of the Minister of Public Utilities on this official delegation, could you indicate to this House if any memorandum of understanding will be signed between the government of Ghana and Trinidad and Tobago to improve the water supply in this country, which citizens have been suffering for over the last 5 years?
I will not entertain this question at this time. I recognize the member for Urupuch East.
To the Acting Prime Minister, having regard to the recently concluded elections in Guyana, can the Acting Prime Minister confirm whether or not this government has recognized the Granger administration as the new government of Guyana?
Acting Prime Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, it may very well be that the member for Oropouche East has better information than the Office of the Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. We in Trinidad and Tobago, in the Office of the Prime Minister, have not yet been informed as to the nature of the new government of Guyana. As far as I can tell from anecdotal information and informal reports, that matter is still being determined. And since it is still being determined, the question is premature.
I recognize the member for Shogunas West. Please.
Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, is the Honorable Acting Prime Minister aware of a joint statement released by the heads of mission of United States, Britain, Canada, and European Union about credible allegations of fraud in the elections in Guyana, and they have called upon the incumbent President Granger to avoid a transition of government which they believe would be unconstitutional and would be based on a vote tabulation process that lacked credibility and transparency. Is the Prime Minister aware of this position of our significant allies?
That question at this time. Supplemental, Urupuchis, proceed.
Thank you very much. Honorable Acting Prime Minister, in light of statements by significant nations regarding this election, is the government of Trinidad and Tobago prepared as well to issue a statement based upon developments in Guyana, where they have now arrived at a conclusion that the electoral process was indeed fraud?
I will not entertain that question. Member for Naprimo.
Yes, thanks. Mr. Acting Prime Minister, given that CARICOM has issued a statement indicating that they are dissatisfied with the results of the election, as indicated by the Prime Minister Granger, what is the position of our government with respect to the CARICOM statement on the matter?
Honorable Prime Minister acting.
Firstly, I would not accept anything that the member for Naparipa says without checking it first. Firstly. And secondly, unlike the UNC, the PNM does not interfere in the internal affairs of another sovereign state.
Supplemental Urupuchis.
Thank you very much, Acting Prime Minister, for this statement that the government will not interfere. Are you aware that a minister in your government has already pronounced on this matter?
Member for Princeton. Next question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, to the Honorable Acting Prime Minister, could the Acting Prime Minister indicate a definitive date when the first tranche of VAT bonds would be made available, since he publicly stated that it would be done in the first quarter of 2020?
Acting Prime Minister.
Consistent with my public statement, the target date is the end of the first quarter in 2020.
Supplemental Princeton.
Deputy Speaker, I think that the Honorable Acting Prime Minister got the question wrong, because it asks for a specific definitive date, and you indicated that it will come in the last quarter. Your answer does not give us a definitive date, and that's what the question is asking. So I'm asking for a definitive date.
Right, so your question is a definitive date, your supplemental. Acting Prime Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, as far as I know, the end of the first quarter is the 31st of March. As far as I know. And therefore, I repeat, the target date for the issue of interest-bearing government bonds to deal with VAT arrears is the end of the first quarter, which is the 31st of March. That's the target date.
Princess Tong, will you give way to Carney East? Or I recognize the member for Carney East.
Would the acting Prime Minister indicate what would be the value of the first tranche of bonds and what would be the total value of the bonds? The question asked the first tranche. I'm asking what would be the value of the first tranche of the bonds and the total value of all the bonds.
In that question also.
Tranche of the bonds. Is it incorporated in the question?
Two questions. Which question?
Answer again, please. What is the value of the first tranche of bonds?
Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. You know, there's a general rule that you should not ask questions where the answer is available in the public domain. And if the honourable member was here, which I think he was, because he asked me a supplemental, when the member for Pointe-a-Pierre asked me the exact same question, I told the member for Pointe-a-Pierre and the honourable member for Carney East that the first tranche is going to be $1 billion. I already said that. It's reported in the papers. It's reported in the Hansard. So why ask the question?
Chief Whip, your member for Pointe-a-Pierre.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. To the Honourable Prime Minister, with respect to the purchase of 3 reciprocating gas compressors trains by the National Gas Company sometime between 2016 and 2018, could the Acting Prime Minister state what was the total cost of this purchase known as the Beachfield Project?
Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm advised that the total cost of purchase of the 3 reciprocating compressors was $14 million. These compressors were intended to guarantee a steady supply in the domestic market in the Cassia field if the BP chalk compression went down. However, BP has desanctioned the Cassia compression project and it is no longer required. As such, NGC is in the process of sending out proposals for an entity to purchase the compressors.
Supplemental, member for Shogunas West.
Thank you. Could the Honourable Acting Prime Minister indicate the cost of purchase of these compressors and okay, pay attention.
All right. Clerk, go ahead.
Okay. Urgent questions?
Proceed. National Security, Minister of National Security.
What?
I went ahead. Urgent questions, so Couva South. Member for Couva South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. To the Minister of Health, could the Minister confirm or deny reports that a female national has tested positive for the coronavirus at a private medical institution on the 5th of March 2020 and is currently in quarantine at the Cora Hospital?
Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have asked the national community and all parties to come together on the issue of COVID-19, and that we should all be responsible. Government, opposition, unions, media, business. No matter what I say in the public domain, members, one or two members, not all, because there are some very responsible members opposite on this COVID issue. But there are some who insist on inviting this virus into Trinidad and Tobago. Let me say categorically for the umpteenth time, according to the Ministries of Health Bulletin number 4, we now send out bulletins twice a day. There have been 30 tests done at CARFA, which is non-political. To date, there are no positive tests. The question asked about somebody in quarantine at Cora, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is no one, not man, woman, child, national, foreigner, UNC, PNM, union, business, there is no one at Cora under quarantine. I don't know how else to say it, especially to Devant Mirage, who takes instructions from member for Saparia. How else to get the irresponsible members opposite? And there are some who are responsible, let me say that.
One.
Karine East is responsible. Barataria Samuel is responsible. But there are some...
Members, have your seat, please. Honorable member, a question was asked and the minister is answering the question. Please, let's maintain the decorum.
Thank you,
your time is up, Mr. Minister. Thank you. Supplemental, proceed.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the risk of being chastised and buffed up and the minister losing his cool in this parliament could...
Member, 1 second. You have a question? No. Member, listen, member, as you are fully aware, you have a preamble to your question. I would respect that you so oblige.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Minister, given the impact upon the financial system as it relates to the coronavirus, the global financial system, could the Minister of Health guarantee the population of Trinidad and Tobago that there will be an adequate supply of medication into Trinidad and Tobago, given what is unfolding worldwide?
Minister of Health.
Madam Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the question betrays a total misunderstanding, and I'd use the word ignorance to mean lack of information. And you have 3 doctors on your bench. Speak to them before you ask technical questions. There is no specific treatment, there is no cure, there is no vaccine for COVID-19. We have in stock, as your member for Caroni East will know, Pfizer and Baratar-Sama, who could advise you that you treat flu-like symptoms, whether it's H1N1, influenza B, or COVID, symptomatically. So, for instance, if the person has shortness of breath, you will give them bronchodilators and oxygen. We have that. If their blood pressure is dropping, you give them medication to do that. There is no specific silver bullet drug, pill, tablet, injection, vaccine anywhere in the universe. Mars, Saturn, Uranus, Jupiter, the sun or the moon to treat with coronavirus. You treat the patients symptomatically and you support them. And your colleague right next to you could tell you that, and Caroni East could tell you that. And for those medications which are not specific to COVID-19, we have more than ample stock. And as I have said in the public domain, in case we run out, Being a signatory to WHO and a financial member, we have access to ParlView strategic stock in Panama for PPE and supportive medication if and when required. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Supplemental, member for Cooper South.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the inquiry was based on the fact that this virus has impacted upon already approaching 100,000 confirmed cases, 3,000 plus deaths, and it had nothing to do with treating the flu-like symptoms and so on. It was based on our concern on behalf of a population of 1.3 million people, whether the medical system will have a supply of drugs such as insulin and other related drugs for the benefit of the population of this country. That is all.
You answered already.
But,
Minister
Mr. Deputy Speaker, you don't use insulin to treat COVID-19. How uninformed can the opposition be? Insulin is used to treat diabetes. If a COVID-19 person, like any other person, needs insulin, they will get insulin. But insulin is not specifically used to treat COVID-19. Could Caroni East, Faizabad, and Barataria Sawa please save the blushes of this opposition, which clearly does not know the first thing about COVID-19, but is intent on bringing it here and bringing panic to Trinidad and Tobago. Please assist the member for Cooper South. Please assist Devant Maraj, who acts on behalf of the UNC on social media. I beg of you, the responsible people next door, Faizabad, Caroni East, Barataria, Sawat. Those three have been responsible so far. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Next question, member for Tabakit. Member for Tabakit. Member for Tabakit.
Thank you.
Next question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the sentence here is badly constructed, maybe a typo, so I'll read it correctly. Could the minister... No, all right, I'll read it as it is, but I want to state that it's not my mistake.
Great. Once again, remember the questions would have gone out to the government already. Once it is that the minister is in a position, kindly proceed.
Read it with the mistake?
Well, no. Make the slight correction you want to, but again, you will have to ensure that the minister can answer.
Okay. Could the minister indicate what training programs have been instituted and when for health workers in hospitals who have to deal with coronavirus cases?
Minister of Health? I'll answer.
You in a position? Proceed.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have been at pains to tell the national community that we are not training people specifically for COVID-19. As Caroni East will know, as Faizabad will know, as Barataria Sawa will know, training is an ongoing activity every month. As they would know, you start to train at the start of every flu season. So yes, we started training in October. What we have done with the training, because of the increased lethality of COVID-19, we have adapted the training using the standard operating procedures. So, we have customized for COVID-19. We have taught first responders on the case definition to look out for signs and symptoms. We have trained them for clinical management. We have trained them for IPC, infection prevention control. We have trained them how to put on and take off PPE. And I have said it publicly. I congratulated the UNC for building the 4-bed quarantine unit at Cora. And we have now improved on it, and another Minister of Health sometime in the future will benefit from your work and my work. That is how we deal with these things, non-politically. We have improved the stations for healthcare workers to put on their PPE and take it off, which was not there before. We have new safety measures and enhanced measures at Cora, enhanced port health training, and we have done retraining to transport suspected cases or confirmed cases. As a matter of fact, GMRTT showed the public on Wednesday the isolation pod where somebody could be isolated within an ambulance system. So all of these are a combination of two things. One, standard operating procedures, which we implement every flu season from October, as Faizabad will know, as Caroni East will know. But we have customized it and tailored it because of the lethality of COVID, which is about 30 times more lethal than H1N1 or influenza B. So that is what we have done to secure the health and safety of our healthcare workers. And this is done at the RHAs. I can't give you an exact figure for the number of persons trained, but each RHA, under the guidance of the Chief Medical Officer, will pull a cadre of first responders.
Minister,
thank you very much.
Member for Laventille West, please. Please. Member for Mearu.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, to the Minister of Finance. Given the public outcry by the business sector regarding the inability of Customs and Excise to properly manage the bonding for all packages in the express logistics sector, could the Minister state whether he will reconsider this instruction until Customs and Excise Division is properly resourced to do so?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I noticed today the questions are based on a number of false premises. There was no instruction by the government to do this. I just want to make that crystal clear. The government and the Minister of Finance did not instruct Customs to do anything with respect to what is known as the express release consignments. What has happened, it appears, and I'm now in the process of getting all of the facts. What has happened, Mr. Deputy Speaker? Apparently in 2011 or 2010, in the 2011 budget statement, the then Minister of Finance, Mr. Dukaran, had made a statement in the budget statement that goods consignments of $20,000 or less, or under $20,000, would not require a formal customs entry. In that statement, he also said this does not require an amendment to the Customs Act. It appears, based on preliminary research, that he was not correct. It does appear that it did require an amendment to the Customs Act. That amendment was never made. So that what the Customs has done, which is, I have received a report and I've asked for further information. What the Customs has done is enforce a law. The law requires both an entry and a declaration. What is happening now with express consignments, the courier system, is that the courier services are now required to prepare an entry, which they were not doing before. And that is where the problem has arisen. So that I have asked the Customs and Excise Division to explain to me exactly what is happening, what was done over the last 10 years or so, what are the consequences and implications of what they are doing. We're looking at it from both sides. One side, the ease of doing business. The other side, we would want to avoid leakage of revenue and importation of illegal items. Because you have to understand that if there is no customs entry, the information is not being put into the computerized Asecuda system, making it virtually impossible for customs to do random checks and to check the manifest and so on to see exactly what the items are. So there is a problem. So we're looking at it from both sides to assist the businesses and also to make sure there is no revenue leakage and no open door for contraband items to come through under the guise of express consignments.
Supplemental, member for Mearu.
Mr. Deputy Speaker. Minister, taking into consideration what you've now said, the fact that we have collapsed on our ease of doing business index from 75 to 105, and this further delay now in terms of these packages, consignments for small business, can any intervention by the government in terms of staying that decision taken by Customs and Excise to reduce the pressure that these small businesses are facing until the relevant adjustments can be made sometime in the future, rather than waiting now and putting a little more pressure on small business.
Right, members, the time has elapsed, but I'll entertain the Minister of Finance for a response.
Yes, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The fact that this has become a controversial issue was only really brought to the fore yesterday when a number of business organizations had a press conference. Prior to that, there was no direct intervention or no direct entreaty towards the Minister of Finance. There were discussions apparently at a lower level between the business organizations and the customs. The fact of the matter is we need to be very careful, understand what is going on here. Prior to the 2011 budget, the value, the threshold for small items, small consignments that do not require formal entry was $1,000. It was strangely and mysteriously moved from $1,000 to $20,000, just so. There's no science to it. And if you think about it, what we are being told is that some firms, not all, would bring in multiple shipments of $19,000. 10 shipments, 20 shipments, all valued $19,500 to avoid the customs entry procedure. And that is creating a problem. So there are real problems here. We need to be careful. I don't intend to rush. I don't intend to take any kind of hard position on this. I understand the difficulties that the business community is talking about. I understand. But we need to be careful. It's not something to have a knee-jerk reaction and just jump into it. It is my intention sometime towards the end of next week, after I gather all the necessary information, to have a meeting with the courier services to see if we could reach some sort of amicable resolution to this matter.
Thank you, Mr. Minister of Finance.
Questions on notice? Questions for oral answer?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is one question for oral response. It will be answered, and there are no written questions for responses. Thank you.
Member for Point-a-Pierre.
Thank you. Question number 36 to the Minister of Communication.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are no plans to reduce the size of the workforce at TTT at this time. Thank you very much.
Request for leave to move the adjournment of the House on definite matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers, personal explanation, introduction of bills, the Administration of Justice Electronic Monitoring Amendment Bill 2020 in the name of the Minister of National Security. Motions relating to the business or sittings of the House and moved by a minister. Public business, committee business motions.
Recognizing member for Laventille West.
Thank you very warmly, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I beg to move the following motion standing in my name. Be it resolved that this House adopt the report of the Joint Select Committee appointed to consider and report on the Private Security Industry Bill 2019 in the 5th session, 11th Parliament. Mr. Deputy Speaker, you will recall that sometime in October of last year, the government presented to this House a bill entitled the Private Security Industry Bill 2019. When we so presented that bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we had little interaction upon it in this House, and we asked that it be sent to a joint select committee. Mr. Deputy Speaker, that would have come as another installment in this government's genuine, well-thought-out attempts to deal with the burgeoning crime situation that afflicts and continues to threaten the people of, and conceptually, Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Deputy Speaker, that would have come after widespread consultations involving the regional body which we call CARICOM Impacts, full name Caribbean Implementation Agency for Crime and Security. It would have come after consultations with a very important Estate Police Association, the Association of Security Companies, the security firms themselves, and others. I recall we had 2 symposia on those matters. One was sponsored by CARICOM Impacts. This would have come against the backdrop of the fact, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the records at the Office of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs would show that we began formally dealing with the idea of regulating private security as far back as 1989. There are records in the Office of the Attorney General revealing that. When I served as a minister in the Ministry of National Security, between the years 2002, 2005, the then Minister of National Security understood the importance of regulating the industry, and it was a major plank in his efforts to deal with the burgeoning crime problem, even at that time. This would have come against the backdrop of the fact that the member for St. Augustine, once holding the office as Minister of Legal Affairs, proudly and accurately told us that he did quite some work to advance these thoughts for its eventual presentation by this government in October or thereabout of 2019. This followed, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the action in the Cabinet, which sent to the Legislative Review Committee this bill, the Private Security Industry Bill 2019, the Supplemental Police Amendment Bill 2019, and the Supplemental Police Amendment Regulations 2019. The last 2 of those 3, the Supplemental Police Bill and the Supplemental Police Amendment Regulations, were necessary because as a result of the measures in this attempt to regulate the private security industry, it impacted the Supplemental Police Act and the Supplemental Police Regulations. In the main, Mr. Deputy Speaker, some of the responsibility of the Commissioner of Police under the Supplemental Police Act and the Supplemental Police Regulations, which would have oiled the wheels of that act, which fell to the Commissioner of Police, with the introduction and the establishment of an authority to regulate private security, that latter authority would have taken over some of the responsibility that the Commissioner of Police had in superintending, in administering the supplemental police in Trinidad and Tobago. As a consequence, and in recognition of that, Cabinet referred to your Joint Select Committee those matters, and they too won our attention. The membership of your committee, Mr. Deputy Speaker, on this matter consisted of yours truly, Mr. Stuart Young, Member of Parliament, Madam Glenda Jennings-Smith, Member of Parliament, Brigadier General retired Ansel Antwine, Member of Parliament, my very good friend, Mr. David Lee, Member of Parliament, Dr. Roodal Moonilal, Member of Parliament, Mr. Clarence Rambarat, Senator Clarence Rambarat, Mr. Nigel DeFatus, Mr. Foster Cummins, Mr. Saddam Hussein, Mr. Paul Richards, and Mr. Varma Dayal Singh, a really all-embracing, bipartisan, if you like, and inclusive of independence, a committee of persons who I might say, as the chairman of that committee, who all distinguished themselves. Many, I must say, the member for Oropuch East, he reminded us, for those who forgot, that he had done research into this area in other dispensations and brought to bear some of that experience on the committee, which the committee is all about. We were ably supported in that work by Ms. Sharon Samuel as our secretary, the indomitable, hard-working Jackie Sampson Miguel as secretary as well, Ms. Renee Batson, assistant secretary, and Crystal Gittins, a graduate research assistant, and they deserve this Parliament's genuine commendation for their contribution to this work. Mr. Deputy Speaker, during the fourth session, your committee held 11 meetings on various days, treating with these issues as you, the larger Parliament, had mandated us to do. In the course of our deliberations, we sought and received, Mr. Deputy Speaker, written submissions from the Air Support Tactical Security Limited, Allied Security Limited, Amalgamated Security Services Limited, 3 operators in the platform of private security, the American Chamber of Commerce of Trinidad and Tobago, AmCham, the Association of Security Companies of Trinidad and Tobago, otherwise called ASCOT, Estate Police Association of Trinidad and Tobago, the EPA, made fulsome submissions and contributions, Imgin Security Services Limited, Cygate Security Agency Limited, and of course, the National Maintenance Training and Security Company Limited, our well-known MTS, a large player in the business as a state enterprise in the business of private security. And of course, we didn't limit it to that. We sought and received written submissions, and they made an oral presentation to us, the Montreal Document Forum out of the Geneva Center for Security, Security Sector Governance. The Montreal document is not a treaty, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but it is a document which is signed on to by now about 52 nation states of this world, and they are particularly concerned and have a lot of documentation following tremendous intellectual work and research into the business of private security services and private armies, some of which operate in theaters of conflict in this world, in this troubled world. So we had the benefit of their international deliberations on the matter, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Suffice it to say, in the view of all members of the committee, and I venture to speak on our behalf, we had fulsome discussions from a wide cross-section of players in the industry and benefited greatly from their thoughts and submissions. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the course of these deliberations, a number of key issues came up. So we went through the bill that we took to the Joint Select Committee clause by clause and allowed every member of the committee an opportunity to advance his or her thoughts on each of them, concepts, words, meanings in the very bill. We did that. We were able to identify very early some of the key issues that may have stood out for our contemplation. And we did identify, I would think, about 35, in fact, not about, 35 issues we identified as germane to the matters in front of us. and the 35 issues that may have troubled a particular member or members, and it required thought, analysis, and resolution. In fact, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I might tell you that of those 35 issues, 12 of them led to amendments to the bill that was brought to our committee, to your committee. So 12 of these 35 issues led to amendments, some of which you will hear of in a short while, and 23 of those issues were resolved between us in terms of a satisfactory discussion, understanding of the matter, and we were all to see the back of it by way of resolution. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we carried on the work over the period as I indicated, and we are now before this Parliament again to debate the report of your Joint Select Committee. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we completed that work, and your committee recommends that the Parliament agree with its proposals for the amendments to the bill, as I alluded to a while ago, and these amendments are attached at Appendix 2 to this report. And your committee further recommends that this Parliament consider and adopt this private security industry bill as amended. We have attached to this report a consolidated version of the bill for ease of reference, and of course all of the deliberations of the committee are recorded herein. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this attempt by the government and the very commendable work of your committee to bring us with the report that is before this Honorable House today is based on an understanding that there are about 50,000 or so private security officers, personnel in Trinidad and Tobago based on information garnered from the Ministry of National Security. They work either individually or on their own in some cases, and for the most part, they work out of 268 private security outfits or firms. Mr. Deputy Speaker, hitherto, they have been unregulated, doing their own thing, complying with the laws, industrial relations laws to the extent that they do, and other laws of Trinidad and Tobago, but not regulated. One of the ideas in the policy that supported this legislation was a clear understanding that if you have a national security arm of about 16,000 or so uniformed, sworn personnel who stand and vetted and who stand in defense of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and you had, as in all other countries of the world, a large private security industry operators, if you could regulate that sector and build bridges between that sector and the national or public national security platform, you would have done very well as a nation in the fight against crime and criminality, especially in this world where terrorism is a major issue for our contemplation, even as we speak here today in this house. Parliaments have been attacked. Businesses have been attacked. Schools, hospitals, no place in this world is safe from the opportunist terrorists, and private security firms and their operators play a critical role in protecting the state in terms. It comes as well against a simple and banal understanding that if you have 50,000 security personnel operating in your jurisdiction, that's 100,000 extra eyes. I've heard the Attorney General talk about eyes everywhere, and he's talking about the technology, cameras, everywhere along with other systems which other countries use to protect itself against crime and criminals and terrorists, and those who threaten our well-being and our safety. But even with those cameras, there are rooms where there are monitors, and it takes human eyes to watch those monitors and to put actions and things in place to protect us anyway. So it comes right back to the human eyes. And with a regulated private security industry, you find yourself and you build the bridges between it collaboratively and the state sector, as has happened in other countries. And the country that first and most certainly comes to mind is the state of Israel, notwithstanding all their other issues and challenges and all of that. Insofar as private security is concerned, the private security sector plays a major role in the state of Israel and its protection. It being situated in a place where there's hostility all around, matters that I will not comment upon, but just for stating it as a simple fact. So much so in that country, private security operators can undergo the identical training with the identical weapons and strategies that the army and the police operate by in the state of Israel. So when you encounter a private security officer anywhere in that land, you are effectively encountering a well-oiled, well-armed, equally trained man, as if you had encountered a soldier. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it also understands that you now have 100,000 arms and 100,000 legs that could all be mobilized to the benefit of all of the people and the well-being of our citizens here and visitors in Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the newspapers are replete with stories from time to time about the efficacy, the efficiency of security officers, private security officers, and sometimes the tragedy that befalls them as they carry out their lawful duties. One horrific incident comes to mind in Tobago recently. We lost a private security officer there. I can't remember the man's name. I extend condolences on behalf of this Parliament and the government and the people of Trinidad and Tobago again. But I have a newspaper clipping here, Saturday, November the 9th, 2019, where a security guard died after being shot during a robbery in Malabar Main Road on November the 1st, and he died. I read that he was the cousin of a member of this House, and I sincerely extend painful condolences to that member and that man's family. And this is just one of so many circumstances. Sometimes these officers out there are not suitably attired, they are not suitably trained, they are not suitably sufficient for the rigors of the job, the dangers of the job, that they receive sometimes minimum wages to go to perform. It is hoped that in a regulated environment, and this bill speaks to that, these circumstances will be addressed. It is hoped that the firms who hire them, operating on a higher regulated standard, Mr. Deputy Speaker, will commit offenses, breaches of this law if they fail to equip and they fail to provide them with the equipment and the uniforms and the training that they deserve in order to carry out the work that they must carry out. So in the main, I'm saying that this bill is not for the benefit of the government per se. It is not for the benefit of my friend from Pointe-a-Pierre or the opposition. It is for the benefit of the industry. It is for the benefit of the people of Trinidad and Tobago who are serviced by that industry. And all the stakeholders that I identified who came before us had an opportunity to contribute to these deliberations, And the bill before you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'll get into one or two of the areas very, very shortly, takes into account all of these matters. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I recall when I piloted that legislation, the Daily Express of Friday, the 10th of May, 2019, in its editorial on that day, under the rubric Tightening Up on Security Firms, expressed several valuable opinions therein. But they concluded that editorial, and I simply say it for the record, and for me as Member of Parliament, to put on the record my admiration and my appreciation. You know, sometimes as politicians, we do not always agree with the editorials, the opinions of those who write them. But on this occasion, I found happy agreement. And I would like to place on record the last paragraph of that editorial of that day, which reads as follows, and I quote, "It is plainly unsatisfactory to tolerate security businesses that are casual about acceptable employment practices, provision of training and certification, proper and safe equipment, insensitive to women's needs, and not answerable for public complaints. The new bill, worthy of support by all in Parliament," the emphasis was mine, "will set rules and standards for the security sector and provide for sanctions against violators. Seeing all that is to be rectified, the question at once prompted is, what took the authorities so long?" Unquote. In answer to that question, Mr. Deputy Speaker, not by way of excuse, but by way of explanation, I would say to the opinion writers in the Express, it took us this long, including up to today, because we had to involve all of the stakeholders as we did in your committee. We had to hear the views and the intellect of the member for Pointe-à-Pierre. We had to hear the views and the intellect of the member for Oropouche East. And we had to hear the views of all else who participated in this. And I might tell you happily, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we had those views. We benefited greatly from them. There was agreement among us all on every concept, on every word, on every sentence, on every clause. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is not often that you get that. But those were my observations. We proceeded without rancor, without the usual fights that we would have. It was a case of genuine questioning, wanting intellectual satisfaction to matters misunderstood. And I assure you, as I indicated, in 23 of those 35 issue cases, there was a satisfactory resolution. And I think the members of your committee, if I might say so, deserve to be commended on that as well. I think so. Mr. Deputy Speaker, let me therefore move to some of the provisions of the law that is before us, merely for elucidation, so that members of this Parliament and members of the national community who were not participants in the Joint Select Committee or involved in all of the background work that supported this bill may not be immediately aware of and deserve as citizens of the Republic and as members of this larger Parliament to be reminded of. Those like the Brigadier General Antwine, he would have participated. He don't need this, but there are some in the national community. This bill requires a special majority, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because, as you know, Section 4 and Section 5 of our Constitution enshrine certain rights and responsibilities on all of us in this constitutional democracy. And the law says, for the most part, when you are going to pass measures in this Parliament that are going to touch and concern and affect or abrogate in some instances those rights, you require specified majorities. This bill is one of them. The reason why this bill is so described is because it touches the right to liberty, the right to the individual of enjoyment of his property, and the right of the individual in respect of private and family life. In respect of the right to individual liberty, Section 4 provides that an individual shall have the right to liberty and the right not to be deprived thereof except by due process of law. This right would be curtailed by clauses 49 and 59 of this bill, which empowers a security officer and a peace enforcement officer, something that is new by way of definition, respectively, to detain a person whom he suspects is engaged in unlawful activity or who is committing an arrestable offense. The right to the individual to enjoyment of property is infringed by clauses 28, 29, 49, and 59 of the bill, which empowers an inspector. An inspector here is a creature of the private security authority, the regulatory authority that this bill establishes, to go out there and to seek and obtain information from actors in the industry, from firms, in order to ensure absolute compliance with the dictates and the measures of this law. So we create this position of inspector, and he or she has certain responsibilities, some of which permits him to go into people's otherwise private property, and therefore it raises the constitutional issue as I have described it. And of course, Section 4C provides that the individual shall have the right to respect for his private and family life, and this right would be affected by one of the clauses here, which allows the said inspector to require medical records of security officers and special security officers, two categories under this law. That might be necessary sometimes if there, for example, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is a shooting incident and it is alleged for any reason that he who used the firearm, the security personnel, was under the influence of drink or drug, then it will be necessary, as happens with police officers, to have that officer tested and checked to see whether the allegation is correct and to see whether, if correct, the impact of his being inebriated or under the influence of drugs would have affected his judgment and his actions in the matter, so that a court ultimately, or a decision maker, could decide whether he acted sensibly and reasonably and lawfully as opposed to otherwise. These are some of the matters that are affected by some of the measures in the bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker, or Madam Speaker and Mr. Deputy. And as a result, it requires a special majority. Let me move, therefore, to that one of those areas for amendment. One of the amendments we propose coming out of the committee is an amendment to clause 29, and we are deleting the one that went to committee, and we are substituting it with a new clause 29. And 29.1 will say, or says, an inspector may, during normal working hours, conduct a random inspection of a proprietary security employer and the security officers and special security officers in the employ of that proprietary security employer for the purpose of monitoring the compliance of the proprietary security employer, the security officers and special security officers with this act, the guidelines and the standards. And of course, subclause 2 tells us an inspector shall not enter any building or part thereof in actual use as a dwelling without the consent of the occupier, except under the authority of a warrant issued under subsection 3. So here we introduce the need for a warrant, where a magistrate or justice of the peace must be satisfied upon application or approach by an officer or by an inspector that he has reached a certain standard in order to grant a warrant in order to carry out the investigation of the inspector. Subclause 3 says if a magistrate is satisfied by the information on oath that there is a reasonable ground for believing that any work performed or any condition existing in such building or part thereof contravenes the provisions of this act, he may issue a warrant to an inspector. A warrant, it goes on in subclause 4 to say, issued under subsection 3, shall authorize the inspector named therein to enter the building or part thereof at any time of the day within 1 month. So he's limited by 1 month from the date thereof, accompanied by a police constable. Now that, I may pause to say, is significant because the presence of the police has certain powers under the Police Service Act, Chapter 1501, and in the company of the inspector, if other things are found, like if you go in there to investigate one thing and you find illegal firearms that are not registered by that security firm for use by that security firm, then the police officer present with the inspector can take possession of those and other actions could ensue. So let me continue. Accompanied by a police constable to inspect the building or part thereof in exercise of the powers conferred by subsection 1. All of this, subsections 5, subsection 6, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of that clause 29, really deal with the constitutionality issue because it outlines in great detail what the law identifies to be and what we understand to be due process in satisfaction of the constitutional issue in this. But it requires the majority, and therefore we offer that for the consideration of members of this House. There were other amendments to it. For example, in clause 4, we deleted the words proprietary security organization that posed particular difficulties, and we replaced that with the term proprietary security employer. So we know clearly that the proprietary security employer means an individual, and this is defined in clause 4, means an individual or a body corporate, including a company, which is wholly or partly owned by the government, who employs an individual or other than an estate police employed by the state, a statutory authority or state enterprise to provide a security service. So that is defined along with many other definitions in the law for clarity and a clearer understanding. We propose an amendment in clause 85 to schedule 1, where we say at A in part 1, well, the new item should read, schedule 1:13, a security service operator shall ensure that every dog which it has in its possession, because some of these firms have canine elements and operations, and we, in consideration of the importance of treating these animals with the dignity they deserve, considering the role they play. Only a moment ago, I was having a private conversation with the member for Port of Spain North, St. Anne's West, and he was telling me about the importance of dogs, which the Defense Force has, which the police canine branch has, which the prisons have, which the customs have. As you would know, Madam Speaker, we have dogs that are cadaver dogs that could pick up the scent of a deceased human being. We have dogs that could identify the gunpowder and the oils that would clean weapons. We have dogs that are specialized in identifying drugs of all descriptions, explosives where you're dealing with terrorists and terrorist activity. So they are very, very important. They are traditionally known as man's best friends. And this legislation respects their contribution to national security in this anticipated, regulated environment. And as such, we show that by saying a security service operator shall ensure that every dog which it has in its possession or control is provided with adequate and appropriate food, water, shelter, exercise, and veterinary care as may be required. Having said so, it may surprise you, Madam Speaker, that there are some firms, there are some employers, not only in security, who would not even take the time to provide their staff with some of the basic requirements for human sustenance. And so, Madam Speaker, those are just two of the issues. I do not propose to be much longer because we have been working as a nation on these measures since 1989. We have records in the office, as I said earlier, that shows that. The member for St. Augustine, as a part of the last governmental administration, tells us that he advanced some of this work. We went to the Joint Select Committee in October last year. We asked for an extension of time. We went into a new session, this the 5th session. We did a considerable amount of further work and fine-tuning on it. And Madam Speaker, the measures as amended are now before us. I need say, in closing, that when we do this for the benefit of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. In this regulated environment, employers will be set with new and additional responsibilities for their personnel. The personnel will be set with new responsibilities and expectations. All of the statutory issues, whether it's NIS and health surcharge and all of that, some areas that proved to be problematic in the past would come in focus. The authority that is set up here, we consulted as well. We found the Jamaican experience where they have a regulatory authority. We had some of the Jamaicans come here on the same Impacts Forum and told us what they do and how they do it. We benefited from that. Long before that, we got the regulatory authority out of the United Kingdom. We had a Dr. Clamp, who was the director of that agency. We invited him to Port of Spain. He came, we had an all-day symposium, and he too shared with us precisely how the British regulated this. I think they regulated since 1992, if my memory serves me correct. But I'm saying all that to let you know we really had the benefit of all the best practice experiences around the world. And therefore, Madam Deputy Speaker, without more, I propose these measures to your larger House on the understanding and satisfaction that the other members of your committee would have no difficulty in supporting these measures. In those circumstances, I beg to move.
Honourable members, I will now propose the question for debate. Be it resolved that this House adopt the report of the Joint Select Committee appointed to consider and report on the Private Security Industry Bill 2019 in the 5th Session, 11th Parliament. Member for Oropouche East.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, for the opportunity to contribute on this motion before the House today. The motion reads, be it resolved that the House adopt the report of the Joint Select Committee appointed to consider and report on the Private Security Industry Bill 2019 in the 5th Session, 11th Parliament. And there we are. The private security industry, Madam Speaker, is an industry that has been around, we estimate, for about 50 years in Trinidad and Tobago. There are indeed hundreds of companies and what could easily be tens of thousands of employees in this industry. The industry is extremely complicated in terms of the breadth of companies, size of companies, in terms of the particular workers involved, with increasingly with increasingly more members of the security sector being low paid, low wage, and indeed low-skill employees. Over the past 20 years or so, we have also had an increase in terms of the amount of female employees in this sector as well. Madam Speaker, the minister indicated, and the chairman of the committee, that he can date this type of attempt at putting legislation in place back to 1989. And I have no doubt that that is correct. But I also remember by 1994, it was National Security Minister Russell Huggins, I believe, had also made some type of intervention on this matter. Madam Speaker, the member for Laventille West is indeed correct when he pointed out that I had also spent some time in terms of my own research over the years for academic pursuits. I'd spent some time researching this area and indeed writing on the private security industry. That also led me to interface with several of the players and several of the key people involved in the industry, and there are about 5 or 10 people who have been there really for many, many years. And we did have the benefit of their contribution and their thoughts on this matter. One interesting point to start with is that the major stakeholders here, all the stakeholders, actually agree that there must be legislation, there must be law, there must be regulations, so that we don't have that obstacle where stakeholders believe that we ought not to do it, or Parliament ought not to intervene, or we should not develop regulations and law, regulating the sector. So we have consensus that we must have regulation. What we may not have is consensus as to the extent of the regulations, to the extent of the law. I begin, Madam Speaker, let me begin at the end. There was a meeting. First, the member pointed out that the work of this committee crossed the 4th to the 5th session of the Parliament. Indeed, we saved the work so that we can continue in the 5th session. But, Madam Speaker, something very curious took place in this 5th session concerning this report, and I will just point it out early. Madam Speaker, there was one meeting in the 5th session, and only one meeting. It was on November 7th, 2019. Interestingly, and we have the records now as part of our report, Madam Speaker, committee members attending, Chairman, Mr. Fitzgerald Hinds, MP, Ms. Glenda Jennings-Smith, MP, Mr. Clarence Rambarat, Member, Senator, Mr. Nigel De Freitas, Member, and Independent Senator Dr. Varma Dayal Singh. Those who were excused and absent, Mr. Stuart Young, MP, Brigadier General Retired Ansel Antoine, MP, Mr. David Lee, MP, Dr. Roodal Moonilal, MP, Mr. Paul Richards, MP, Independent Senator, Mr. Saddam Hussein, Senator, and Senator Mr. Foster Cummings. So you had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You had about 7 members absent from this final meeting. The meeting started at 2:41 p.m. and ended at 3 minutes past 3. Now, so how much minutes? 22 minutes. Now, the custom has always been that when you make your first meeting of any committee, that meeting is there for the appointment of a chairman to discuss the quorum and plan your action. You may take the time as well to plan an agenda and say, look, we want to do A, B, C, and this is the time we are looking at. So, Madam Speaker, it did not pain me that I was absent at that meeting. I was, in fact, out of the country. In fact, I was out of the country as well at that time. And I was not at pains because you understand, Madam Speaker, the purpose of the first meeting. Incidentally, when you look at the records, unless I'm mistaken, I would have attended 90% of the meetings. I can't recall missing any meeting of this Joint Select Committee, except the first meeting in the 5th session, where the Speaker, your good self, ma'am, would come and go through what we are very familiar with, a process. That process took place. It started at 2:41. Madam Speaker, upon being appointed chairman, the member for Laventille West took the chair, And then a discussion took place on the quorum, and they agreed to have a quorum of 3 persons with representation from both houses. The terms of reference discussed. But there's a part here that is interesting. The chairman invited members to review the final report and provide feedback. There was unanimous agreement by members present to adopt the report as circulated. The secretary to the committee was instructed to prepare the final report for presentation. Now, even the member for Laventille West, you know, I noticed a smirk on his face. The chairman invited members to review the final report and provide feedback. Everybody said things good. So within about 10 minutes of becoming chairman, report finished. 7 persons absent at that first meeting. And the member for Laventille West got up and said, "Job well done," with a report on the private security industry that requires a constitutional majority. This is not a report that requires a simple majority. You are dealing with rights, you are dealing with powers, you are dealing with issues, you know, of confidentiality, privacy. And in 22 minutes of a meeting, and when we check the records, having presided, I believe, for 13 minutes of the meeting, report adopted. Everybody happy. Now, Madam Speaker, I don't know if the member is serious or not. I don't know if the member did not for any reason, because I know, you know, Madam Speaker, I know I'm developing quite a history with members opposite, where they may not want me on committees and so on. But on my absence at the first meeting, for the purpose of appointing a chairman, report finalized, and no member of the opposition, myself, Pointe-a-Pierre, or the Senator Saddam Hussein were present. We were not present. And again, at the first meeting of a committee, you can look at the records. I've been around this place for 20 years or so. Generally, you would have a few members who would absent themselves at the first meeting because it is not considered that the first meeting would really dive into the meat of an area to deal with the substantive matters. You would always plan your work and agree on quorum and agree on chairman. And so sometimes members may not even agree, take part. In fact, we had a next committee where we appointed, I think, the member for San Fernando West in his absence as chairman of a committee. He wasn't even there. But we got the good news that he was willing and able to be chairman. He wasn't there, so we appointed him because we didn't get the impression that he was going to rebel. So he was appointed chairman. So, I make that point that this cannot be real. You cannot take an important matter like this and treat it in that way. Madam Speaker, another introductory point is that we believe that the government is going about this in the wrong way, in that there's excessive bureaucracy with this bill. Excessive bureaucracy that can send a shock through this sector if it is passed in its present form. Because right through the committee meetings, if you look at the records, Madam Speaker, myself, Senator Hussein, Mr. Pointe-a-Pierre, and others, kept speaking about bureaucracy, that we needed to reduce the bureaucracy, reduce the amount of institutional weight in the bill, to simplify matters more, to simplify. That came across strong. Madam Speaker, even when we had we invited persons to attend, again, the verbatim notes are available. It was our impression, at least those of us on this side, that that was wrong one. It was a wrong one of interview, of examination. We could not believe that that was it. In fact, our understanding was that the persons will be called back. In fact, the chairman in the verbatim reports alluded to that when he said, we will study your presentations in more detail and we can pick up some of these issues later. So persons were invited, they came. They made an introductory type of 5-minute statement, took a few questions, what we all believe to be wrong one. And then we were going to come back and have further discussions in detail and in depth. So persons in this sector were visibly taken aback when they heard that a bill came to Parliament for approval. They said, well, what happened there? Because much more needed to be said. And, Madam Speaker, this involves giving license to security officers. First, there are 3 or 4 different categories. Security officer, peace enforcement officer, which is a new concept here, private investigator, and 1 or 2 others, Madam Speaker. And you are going to give license to the security officer. There's a bureaucracy. You are going for the companies, what could be 100 companies, have to be provided with a license. I think it is still in the bill, 60 days. But I'm seeing in the corrected version, 60 days. And these are some of the issues that we raised. For example, the appointment of inspectors. We are not providing in this bill for the qualifications of inspectors. They just say that they should be qualified. But qualified in what? And serious powers they have to enter property, to seize, to affect business. But there is no qualification unless we're mistaken. So, so our position here is that this JSC report is inaccurate and incomplete. The member for Port of Spain, North St. Anne's West may well speak because it is a matter dealing with Ministry of National Security and so on. But the member himself was not there at this critical meeting when the report was adopted. And if truth be told, we have the attendance here as well. The member for Port of Spain, North St. Anne's West missed several meetings in an area that you would think that the member himself would want to be there because this is a critical sector in national security, and was not there for the final meeting as well. You see, Madam Speaker, we conclude that this report is inaccurate and incomplete, and we ought not to adopt it in its current form. In page 8 of the report, there are key issues that arose from the meeting of the Joint Select Committee. We were asking, for example, for international comparison as to what other jurisdictions establish these specific types of security officer and the categories and so on. Which jurisdictions were used to derive these categories, and further issues we raised in terms of definition. Nowhere in the report did we get answers, Madam Speaker. The powers of the private investigators, pursuant to 9 Clause 55 of the bill, a special security officer is defined as a close protection officer, peace enforcement officer, and a private investigator. While the closed protection officer and peace enforcement officer were defined in Clause 4 of the bill, nowhere does it define what are the duties and functions of a private investigator. And we do not have private investigator legislation, Madam Speaker. We raise an issue, Clause 34. According to the Association of Security Companies of Trinidad and Tobago, ASCOT, they said that we should change 60 days to 14 days. A 60-day wait is much too much for business. To wait 60 days for the authority to issue a license, allowing an officer to work, is much too long. Right? Imagine you have 30,000 officers who need to get a special license, a license from this authority, Madam Speaker. And you have 60 days you have to wait. What will happen to all the security installations? What will happen to security on the whole if persons are not properly licensed according to the law? They cannot work, Madam Speaker. And there are also issues in this bill which we believe that it could lead to further unemployment, reduction in terms of employment because of the unnecessary burden of bureaucracy that they are providing here, Madam Speaker. So that 60 days should really be 14 days or so, we recommend. In terms of the powers of investigator, imagine there's no qualification stipulated as to what is the qualification for an inspector, but that person has wide-ranging powers under this bill. The qualification of an inspector is that of a constable who is the holder of a precept under the Supplemental Police Act, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we had another fundamental issue in terms of the composition of the authority, where it is provided that the authority be composed of a chairman and vice chairman, both of whom must be attorneys at law with 10 years standing, appointed by the president, I believe, on the recommendation of the judicial, I just want to get it absolutely right. Yeah, Madam Speaker. The Judicial and Legal Service Commission, yes. It is at clause 6, we believe, Madam Speaker. And I'll just want to read that for the record. Clause 6, yes. The authority should have a chairman, a deputy chairman, attorneys at law, appointed by the president on the recommendation of the Judicial and Legal Service Commission. The commissioner of police or officer recommended by him above a certain rank. A representative of the ministry with responsibility for labor. A representative of the business sector. But here, this is a problem we had, and it is still here. A representative of the business sector who is not associated with the private security industry. So that person, by definition, is a business person, but would not have had any years working with the private security industry, would not be involved in it. So it's just a business person. Whereas there was a recommendation by those of us on this side that the board, this authority, should have a representative of the employers, of the security companies. We also recommended that because this is a low-wage, low-skill sector where there's enormous potential for abuse, the issue of worker protection should be a fundamental objective of the Act, which I believe in some part it is. But to reflect that now, apart from the law which we outlined, to reflect that, a workers' representative should be on the authority. And you don't need to have a union to have a workers' representative that way. You have in this country the established labor groups, and they, just as they provide representatives to various areas and so on, Madam Speaker, they can be invited to put a representative on the authority to look after the interests of workers at the authority. Because this is an area, Madam Speaker, it is historically filled with discrimination, exploitation, Madam Speaker. There was a particular case one year where a female employee was fired. And when we investigate why, the security manager said that she can't fit into her uniform. Well, of course, she was pregnant. So she was fired, Madam Speaker. In this sector as well, people work double shift, triple shift. Absolutely no extra pay, no extra benefit. Sometimes an employer will not even come send a bread and cheese or a sandwich to a worker when they begin a second shift, all day, all night. Some persons may have security at their business place or homes and so on, and your relief don't come, you stay. Without any compensation, food, water, and so on. The dogs, as well, is an area with canine security is important, Madam Speaker. And some of the dogs themselves are malnourished. They keep them, long hours working, Madam Speaker, so that this is why the stakeholders believe we need regulation, but we do not need it so bureaucratic. I mean, in a simple way, how do you give a license to 30,000 people in a short period of time, Madam Speaker? And there's a process. This is not a process like you go into a department in the government and you apply for ID card and you go and get your ID card and so on. It is not as simple as that. You have to satisfy all kind of conditions and so on. You know, so I'm reminded that we have a problem with getting a passport in the country, Madam Speaker, and 30,000 people need to be licensed. 100 companies properly licensed, inspected, checking their their financing, checking their organizational structure, vetting as well. Madam Speaker, there was a situation in Trinidad and Tobago, I think last year or year before, where questions were raised in terms of a private security company working at the airport in Trinidad. Where did that private security company come from? And a person involved there, one of the principals of that company, it is believed was known to the police. So they're busy telling you about politician and MP and so on, and not checking private security companies in this country who are running them. And whether those persons have been vetted to operate of all places in the Piarco International Airport. And not surprisingly, a few months after, we had several problems at the airport with security. Several, Madam Speaker. So the legislation is needed, but you have to ensure that the process is flattened. And that is a process, you know, the others will speak, but throughout this bill, you have this issue of excessive bureaucracy. It involves drug testing as well, Madam Speaker, and the complications arising from that. The time, the process, external to Trinidad and Tobago in some cases, and so on, that you need. Madam Speaker, another issue that we flag really, and this is why I'm saying the bill is incomplete. And if we had a chance to spend, you know, you waited what could be 30-something years for this bill. You wait 31 years for this bill, and you try to do it in 13 minutes, and in 13 minutes you approve it at the Joint Select Committee. And you wait 31 years for this. Surely you could have waited for a few months again, and let us sit down with the government, opposition, independent, and iron it out. A leading figure told me this is a recipe for disaster. It will send a shock through the system with excessive bureaucracy. And the powers, I mean, this is why we need the constitutional majority for this, because the inspectors have enormous power. And no requirement for academic qualifications. No disqualification, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, because it came up at the meeting too. No disqualification for offenses such as dishonesty and so on. So you can hire people. It is left to the authority when we ask the questions in the meeting. They say, no, the authority could decide that. But we wanted to put it in the law, some of these issues. What disqualifies someone? And don't leave it to the authority to stipulate everything. An authority which, Madam Speaker, will not have the benefit of worker representatives, and you don't need a union, so don't feel you need a union for that, an in-house union. And, Madam Speaker, the employer is not represented there. The people with the years, the decades and decades of knowledge in the sector. When we raised that, persons, I think, said, well, it's conflict of interest because you will be employer and then you will be passing policy and so on, and you are a part of the sector. Madam Speaker, there are many areas now where persons are associated with a company and they sit on boards and so on. You declare your interest, of course, and you move on, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, the composition of the authority is a fundamental issue that we flagged as well. Then the appointment of the Chief Executive Officer, we had some problems with that as well, Madam Speaker, in terms of the qualifications. Some of it was dealt with. We had problems as well, Madam Speaker, with the overall issue of qualifications in this bill. We felt that you just cannot leave it open to the authority or anyone to prescribe minimum qualifications for security officers. Madam Speaker, a lot of robbery, when I say a lot, robberies, larceny and so on, you have had a lot of cases where it is suspected, it is believed that persons have been charged, security guards have been charged in connection with robberies at several stores and banks, and not just Trinidad and Tobago, across the world. There's a famous writer on this, Professor Nangati from Zimbabwe, a colleague of mine for many years. And he has written and actually tabulated some comparative work in several of these southern African countries on private security industry, and has pointed out that this failure to properly vet and put qualifications lead over time to more crime, Madam Speaker. And that is an important piece of work there. So, yeah, so who is the head of a security company? You know, that vetting is very, very important. And I think in some measure it is dealt with, in some measure, Madam Speaker. But Madam Speaker, a fundamental issue, and the member raised it. When you look through the report as well, there's another fascinating point about this, apart from the 13-minute meeting, Madam Speaker. At the beginning, they said issues that were raised, and I'm seeing issue resolve, explanation provided. Madam Speaker, when you look at the report, many of these have not been resolved. Concerns have not been resolved, Madam Speaker. Explanation provided. When did all these explanations were provided in the 13-minute meeting? When, Madam Speaker? We don't have it here. The fines, the issue of fines as well. We had raised that in terms of ensuring that they be reasonable. I think there are still concerns about the fines, that they must be reasonable. And that, Madam Speaker, is an issue that if the committee had an opportunity to continue its work, we could have brought change there as well, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, my colleague from Pointe-à-Pierre at some time will also speak on these matters in terms of the business perspective and how this bill undermines in some way business operations, Madam Speaker. So I don't want to get into it too much. But to flag a few issues. While you do have representation from the Ministry of Labor, it is also curious, Madam Speaker, that you have the police, of course, represented there, but not unless I have an old draft in my hand, Madam Speaker, you don't have representation from the Ministry of National Security. And you would think that the Ministry of National Security would be the ministry that really drives this type of business. Because you have a chairman, deputy chairman, commissioner, representative, a business person, someone from the Ministry responsible for labor. Now, when we say that, usually we are thinking about the inspectorate, the factory inspectorate, so to speak, or the OSHA. And we had raised this in the committee as well, that we should amend further this section that deals with the composition of the board and have specifically representatives from the OSHA, not just the Ministry of Labor, because the Ministry of Labor the Ministry of Labor has factory inspectorate, has OSHA, has worker compensation, all issues there. Because what will happen is that the ministry will put a representative.
Member for Oropouchis, the original 30 minutes are now spent. You have 15 more minutes to wind up if you wish. You may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So what will happen, Madam Speaker, as a policy, the Ministry of Labor will put a representative from a particular department, but there is no guarantee, the way it is structured now, that the OSHA will be represented. And that is the key issue in this area, because the minister indicated as well that there are occupational hazards, there are enormous problems associated with this sector, conditions of work problems and so on, health and safety problems and so on. So that we would have preferred to see the OSHA properly represented there in terms of the board. Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, just a couple more points I think we will raise at this issue. The clauses I already alluded to, 29, which the minister indicated that they had redrafted, But in redrafting it, it still did not take care of some of the concerns we had. Registering the companies, there are concerns that we raised with that as well. The issue of the affirmative or negative resolution in Parliament, we raised that as well. 15, clause 15, we had a concern there, and I just want to read it so we're very clear. Now, Madam Speaker, I really have to locate these things in the bill because I don't want to run the risk of not giving accurate statement. Utilizing monies in the fund, that was an issue raised. There shall be a fund utilized in defraying the expenses incurred in carrying out the functions of the authority, the remuneration of allowances of members, officers in the authority, the capital and operating expenses, other expenses, and so on. We had raised some concern about this fund because this institution is funded by the taxpayer, appropriated by Parliament. Monies will be paid by the authority by way of fees and so on, and we had a concern about the auditing of those monies being paid and their relationship to the audit conducted by Ministry of Finance, which is the usual and regular course of action. The clause 19, I'm just putting on record a few of the issues we raised. The authority shall be exempt from stamp duties, corporation taxes, custom duties, purchase tax, value-added tax, motor vehicle taxes, and so on. We had a concern with this in that the concern here was simple. We are putting into the law exemptions that the authority would be exempt from stamp duty, corporation tax, custom duties, and so on. As an automatic matter, as a clause, it becomes statutory. Whereas we believe that the Ministry of Finance, the Minister of Finance, and the Cabinet, by extension, should really be properly empowered to oversee this. So let me give an example. If WASA or the EMA or somebody want to bring in a vehicle, they want exemptions on all the duties and taxes and so on. Not a sporting car from Switzerland or Sweden. So, Madam Speaker, as it is now, Madam Speaker, as it is now, this authority can purchase anything. And they go to the board and they say, look, under the law, we have exemption from taxes and custom duties and everything. It is in the law. Whereas there was a case, I think recently, last year or so, with some of the authorities going wild with buying vehicles and buying up all type of things and getting exemptions, Madam Speaker. There was a concern in the public domain about that, and that is why we raised this issue then at the meetings, the Joint Select Committee, that the Cabinet and the Minister of Finance should properly authorize any exemption. Notwithstanding, it is a state enterprise like this. You cannot just leave it to boards like these to say under the law they could exempt anything. Suppose they decided to buy 10 cars in the year to do their work. A car for the chief executive officer. And suppose they decided to do that. You have no ministerial approval. You have, now, good governance required that the minister is kept informed and approves these things. And the minister, worth his salt, would want to go to Cabinet and get Cabinet to approve it as well. And this has happened in the state enterprise sector all the time. Companies run away when you give them power. They run away. They buy all type of things. They spend all kind of money. I mean, we had this situation with the credit card. Anybody remember that? Where a minister of government fly all over the world and use a credit card to buy, I forgot what it was. No. At the HDC, Madam Speaker, some years ago, before 2010, a particular managing director, and Madam Speaker, before 2010, a particular managing director had to get some money. I think it was an emergency of one kind or another, and just went and take the money. Gone. The Minister of Housing did not know. When we found out years after, he said it was an emergency, a medical emergency, and he paid back the money. 4 years later, I think he paid back the money, Madam Speaker. So, these authorities can run away if you give powers like these. And again, 19, we had a key concern about 19. We had a key concern. 21, Madam Speaker, 21.2. Why 3 months, Madam Speaker? When you put 3 months here, the 3 months will effectively be 6 months, and sometimes for years these reports never find themselves in the Parliament. The minimum level of qualifications for the post of CEO, well, they explain that and they put something in that. And this creature called the Peace Enforcement Officer, I think we developed some idea about what it was in the meetings. And again, Madam Speaker, again, we needed to speak a bit more about that. So, in closing, Madam Speaker, it's a difficult proposition to come today to the Parliament and ask the opposition to support this in its present form, given that on reading it itself, if you read the report, if you read the synopsis at the beginning of explanations and so on, everything points an incomplete piece of work. Everything. And given the dramatic events of November 7, 2019, when at the first meeting of the session, the chairman is appointed, and in record time, the report is finalized, everybody agreed. 4 members, I think, were there present on that day, if I'm not mistaken, 7 absent. And they agreed, and they said, look, this is fine, let's go to Parliament. And I end by stating, the obvious questions that you will ask is, well, where is the minority report? If you are speaking like that, where is the minority report? Madam Speaker, you cannot get a minority report when you ambush these joint select committees like this. We were never informed, Madam Speaker. The other day, what we had to do, we had to stay in touch with the process, Madam Speaker, and at all material time, we had to ask, when is the final draft coming? When is the deadline for our minority report? How, the time frame? We would not, and so we could not put in a minority report because, and some members, including members outside of the opposition, were just taken aback while the report came. In fact, when this report came to the Parliament, we thought it was an interim report. And we thought it was an interim report because we knew the amount of work we had to do. We know the stakeholders, we had to be consulted further. And while we consulted stakeholders who are employers and so on, the large employers and so on, this area has enormous small and micro operators, small business. A company can have 5 people, 10 people. In the same sector, security, you could have 3,000 workers. So the small business sector, unless we are mistaken, was not consulted, were not invited to come in. So we can engage with them and get their views and so on, because this will affect small business, Madam Speaker. It will affect small business. And we know that the member for Laventille West has a particular approach to joint select committees. He has worked in this area and he has been around for some time. I think earlier he was telling us about his stint 2002, 2005 or 7. I think after 2007, he was out of the compound for a while and then stayed out for a long time and returned in 2015, Madam Speaker. So we know him, and he has this way of moving like flash, swiftly. He moves like flash, swiftly. And you have to slow him down and tie him down and peg him down and keep him, rein him in sometimes because he's moving like flash. And he takes his time and asks a lot of questions and so on, but the business of meetings cannot be conducted this way. And you cannot ambush the opposition with critical legislation like this. I mean, you should not ambush anybody, but not this type of critical legislation. So I ask the government to rethink their position, to reconsider their position, and those of us on this side will be very happy to return to any other committee to assist the government and the country with developing this legislation, because the member for Pointe-à-Pierre and others will point out further defects in the bill, Madam Speaker. I thank you.
Member for Portus Spain North, St. Anne's West.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this bill this piece of legislation is long overdue. I don't think there will be a single sensible person in the industry or otherwise that can put forward any justification as to why an industry such as the private security industry should not be regulated. That's the first point. The regulation of this industry, Madam Speaker, is long overdue. As the member for Oropuch East pointed out somewhere in his contribution, the persons who are employed in this industry are not the persons who are the higher levels of our society, unfortunately. In fact, this is an industry, if we're being honest here today, where there is a tremendous amount of exploitation of persons. And it is irresponsible for anyone to say that there should not be regulation of this industry, and it is not long overdue. To set the record straight and to remind the population, through you, Madam Speaker, there were 11 meetings of this Joint Select Committee. There is nothing that is complex about the regulation of this industry. We're talking about the necessary regulation of private security firms. Immediately you understand that to mean that you should be regulating the owners of the company as to whether they should be granted licenses, and also regulating through license those who will work on the streets, those who will be charged with the responsibility and the dangerous responsibility of finding themselves sometimes in very secluded places, alone, without support and without backup, at all hours of the early wee morning, to offer a level of protection to property and persons all over the country. And that is what, quite simply, this legislation is about, Madam Speaker. So what we're seeking to do via this legislation is to protect the workers. So quite contrary to what was being suggested, that this would lead to a loss of jobs, this is about protection not only of jobs, but more importantly, protection of lives. Protection of lives of some in our society who unfortunately, up to this point in time, had no proper protection, whilst they were being called upon to perform these tasks associated with private security officers of all different levels. And I'd like to start by commending the member for Laventille West for the work that he took on personally in driving this process. Because you see, it must go on the Hansard, Madam Speaker, that the member for Laventille West saw this particular assignment as being an essential and important one, and he himself went and drove the work by sitting for many hours, not only with the staff from the Attorney General and Legal Affairs Office, but also with the staff of National Security. And I'd like to thank all of the members of staff who assisted in the production of this piece of work. And this legislation here today captures all of the necessary elements for the protection of the industry, but also of the public. Because you see, if the men and women working in this industry are properly protected, Madam Speaker, and they feel protected, and the law protects them, then the public is better served. And yes, we in national security have a close relationship with these private security firms. Some of them, the bigger, more reputable ones. But there are many, many, many security firms in Trinidad and Tobago that over a period of time, over decades, were granted authorization by national security to commence their firms. And this piece of legislation, this bill, seeks now to regulate the whole industry. So let's start. 11 meetings. A lot of weather made, a lot of noise made about the fact that on the 11th meeting, which was the only meeting in this session, was where the report was finalized and certain persons were missing. But as the member for Oropuch East told the population, he attended over 90% of the meetings. And at none of those meetings Was anybody prevented from contributing and to making their points? And when you start by looking at the report, Madam Speaker, and you go through the key issues expressed by members and stakeholders, and it talks about explanation provided, or bill appropriately amended, or issue revolved, it is being a little dishonest to suggest that under those lines, the explanation isn't provided. Issues. What that is a synopsis of what went on at the meetings. So, for example, at the meetings I attended, the member for Point-a-Pierre made a number of pertinent inquiries, suggestions, etc. And then we would sit down along with the independent senator, along with others on the committee, and we would work through the reasoning why. And I think a good example of that is one of the last points raised by the member for Oropuch East. He talked about the peace enforcement officer. And again, in his typical style, highlighted and made noise about what is a peace enforcement officer. I recall that meeting, and the member for Point-a-Pierre is smiling because he recalls it as well. For the population, and to show you how well thought out this bill is, and how it took into consideration the submissions, the sensible submissions of all who participated. This is a great example in the definition of a peace enforcement officer. We've just come out of a carnival period. We've just come out of a period where hundreds of thousands of revelers take to the streets all across Trinidad and Tobago. And in Port of Spain in particular, there are a number of large bands. And part of my duty was to be out there and to see how things that we had been planning for months were functioning. And I remember looking at some of these large bands and seeing thousands of revelers walking, partying on the streets safely. The first line of defense were these peace enforcement officers. So for the first time, legislatively, peace enforcement officers is definition given to the men and the women who provide private security by something as simple as walking alongside these bands and ensuring that the revelers who have paid to participate in the carnival bands were safe. They had never before been recognized or protected, and we are doing that here today. But of course, in the typical fashion and style, because it is legislation that requires the support of the opposition, we have to come here and hear, if you want our support, do this. You didn't take me on, you had 11 meeting and we weren't there, but everybody participated. And I challenge the members to show what it is in this bill that has not been amended, that was not considered. Because you see, to make a point or to have an alternate view that is not accepted, Madam Speaker, does not mean it is a fatal flaw to legislation. So let's read into the Hansard. Peace enforcement officer means an individual employed A, to prevent individuals from entering premises or to eject individuals from premises, or B, to guide or cordon off individuals during an event. So these officers, as we've called them for the first time, are those, for example, who hold ropes or who hold a line along a carnival band to prevent outsiders from interfering with paid revelers. But it also encaptures, and the member for Point 14 for Point-a-Pierre would recall this, it captures persons at events, for example, in big stadiums or in concerts away, etc., who are not private security officers as we know them. They're not walking around with they might just have a fluorescent jacket on over them, and they're directing a crowd to make sure that people are safe, to ensure they're ushering crowds, and they exist. And what we're doing here today to show via one simple example how far-reaching this bill is, how necessary it is, and how well thought out it is, I will use that example from the member of Oropuch East. A lot of noise was made about Clause 8 and the board. For the first time, what we're saying is we will regulate the private security industry, and we will set up an authority to do so. And for the population, through you, Madam Speaker, the sole purpose of this authority and its resources are to regulate this industry, to regulate the 30-odd thousand officers who exist. That is their only duty. So it is not to say that the vetting process that we've put 60 days at for the grant of a license, either to the firm or to an officer, is something that the authority and its personnel should not be able to do, because that is the only duty they have. So the first line of attack, which is very easy to discard of, having listened to it and thought about it, is the composition of the authority itself. So we heard a lot of fuss about workers not being represented, and it doesn't have to be a union, but contradicting, on the other hand, in the next sentence by saying there are a number of bodies that represent these unions. I assume that means like a NATOC, a FITON, but those are unions. They're the JTUM, they're the representatives of the union, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it is provided for. Because you see, in looking at this, the chairman and deputy chairman, each of whom shall be an attorney at law of at least 10 years standing and appointed by the JLSC. That is fine. The whole purpose of the authority is to regulate. So you're saying that lawyers have something special in the interpretation of law, protection of rights. That's their job. You then go down to the commissioner or a police officer, the rank of assistant commissioner. Again, that is very sensible to have the police participating at the board level of the authority. They are the experts in law enforcement. They are the ones who would bring to the table that level of expertise that is necessary. Because understand, all the authority is there for is to regulate. They're not doing anything more than that, to ensure that the industry is working properly. The next one, a representative of the ministry with responsibility for labor. There can be no better body that does not have a vested interest in the protection of workers than the Ministry of Labor. Unions, as we know, in the choice of unions in this country, there is not a single body that represents the views of all unions. There are fights and disputes amongst the bodies of unions, even those three largest representative bodies. They don't see eye to eye. The Ministry of Labor's purpose is to protect both the workers and the employers. So that is immediately captured. To try and mislead the population and say that the workers wouldn't have a say and the employers wouldn't have a say is false. The Ministry of Labor is best suited to conduct that. The next position is a representative of the business sector who is not associated with private security industry. This is a regulatory body. Suppose now this body needs to decide whether to take away a license from somebody in the industry. How could you have somebody who is from the industry, an owner of a company in the industry? Suppose now they want to lead the charge, because this is a multi-million-dollar industry. This is a multi-million-dollar industry. The contracts in some of these companies get are worth millions, tens of millions of dollars. So suppose now the person sitting on the board, who is the owner of one of these companies, company X, wants to get rid of his competitors, Y and Z. Isn't that a clear conflict of interest? So what we say is, no, have somebody from the business sector who's not associated with the private security industry. If I am the owner of the second largest company, and the member for Laventille West is the owner of the first, and I am sitting on the board, and I want to get the contracts he is getting, I can maneuver via the board to get him out. So we said, no, we're not allowing that. Have somebody sensible from the business sector sit here. Because at the end of the day, we should all know what a board does. They don't get into the nitty-gritty. They're driving policy. But if you have any fear that they have no room for representation, it is the next clause, the next 8(1)(e), that allows now 4 other persons suitably qualified by virtue of their knowledge of and experience in matters relating to the private security industry. Maybe it is that the member for Oropouche East wasn't prepared. Maybe it is in that 11 meeting he decided I was going to read what they sent. I don't know. But exactly what he was complaining about is fully captured by this. 4 other persons suitably qualified by virtue of their knowledge of and experience in matters relating to the private security industry. So that captures the whole of what he spent 25 minutes screaming to the high heavens about. But I understand, because you see, you could have a degree in law, but never practice law before. So you don't know about the application of law. Right? So then we go on to worker protection. Another point made. Worker protection should be part of the act. And a lot of noise about it. But quickly said, it is a little part. The whole purpose of the act is to protect workers and to protect the public.
That's right, that's right.
And I've just talked about the composition of the board and how it achieves that. Another point that was made, you should have OSH, a representative of OSH, on the board. Completely with the greatest of respect for the member of Oropouche East in this instance, and only in this instance. No more than that. OSH has overreaching jurisdiction over everything in Trinidad. So to put a member of OSH on the board is nonsensical, because you'll then be asking a member of OSH to be in a conflict position. The whole purpose of the Occupational Safety and Health Authority Act is to empower that body to go anywhere, including to the Parliament, including to anywhere, including to the constituency office for the member for Oropouche East, and to check and see and to make sure it's a safe environment. So why would you have a member on the board? That the member on the board now finds himself in conflict, because I've seen it before. That OSH has gone in now to private security firms, is checking to see whether they're safe, they're secure, they're providing for their employees, and then pressure is put on the board member from OSH. No, OSH is a separate entity. OSH is an independent entity. You know, Madam Speaker, what that point brought home to me, and it sums it up in my mind, the attack on the independence of certain bodies. And we've seen it time and time again. So that is the reason why OSH is not part. Yes, and you heard it. I was about to call some examples, but you just heard the member for Naparima. The first utterance as I talk about an attack on an independent body, EBC. That is what Naparima says. So let the record reflect that that is immediately where the mind is. So OSH doesn't have to be on the board. OSH already has a jurisdiction in law to protect. Rubbish point. Exploitation of workers. And they like to throw out these catchphrases to try and pretend that there's some association with the ground, and we're here to protect the workers, and we're here to protect those who are less fortunate, etc. The whole purpose of the legislation is to protect the workers. So to come here and talk about no overtime, no food and water, no relief, and you must take on another shift without even bread and cheese, and it's too bureaucratic, all of these are catchphrases that are being thrown out there, but with no substance. They have no anchoring, Madam Speaker, in the legislation that is before us. Right? And I say it for the record and for those listening and for all of the workers and for the Estate Association, Constables Association that are here. The purpose of this legislation is to protect your membership, as you know. The purpose of this legislation, Madam Speaker, I will talk to who I want. The purpose of this legislation, Madam Speaker, the purpose of this legislation, as I will say again, is to protect the workers in this industry and to protect the public. The old talk about how do you give licenses to 30,000 people. The purpose of the authority is to regulate it. As an example, we, in a 2-week period, with all of the screaming from high heavens, all of the persons who said it couldn't be done, and it is now, maybe not for some people who are upset about the success of the registration process, but it is now being utilized as a prime example of how to get a registration process done. In 2 weeks, we were able to register 16,523 Venezuelans. And these are people, 30,000 in 60 days. They will be able to do it. The authority must be able to do it, and that is their job. That is what they're set up to do. I heard the utterance. One of the persons recently in a private security company with respect to the airport, because you see, this is what they like to do, create a sense of panic, fear-mongering, attack institutions, so now the airport isn't secure, etc. One of the persons in a private security company was a person of interest to the police. Well, that is the reason we're having the legislation. The legislation talks about regulating persons who are going to get licenses to own the firms with a more robust process, that presently applies. And there's now a process with consequences. And what this process says is it grants you a license for 3 years. So it forces the people, which doesn't exist now, because it was a member for Pointe-a-Pierre who asked in one of our meetings, with all of these hundreds of firms that are registered, are they required to keep interfacing with the Ministry of National Security? The answer is no. You get your license, you run off. And it was only if something goes wrong, there's an intervention, and not necessarily an intervention by the Ministry of National Security. So for the first time, what this legislation is doing is telling the firms, after you get over the hurdles, you've been vetted, you've been approved, and you get a license, you have to come back every 3 years. Very sensible. Things happen. Maintain standards. Keep people on their heels, make sure they're doing the right thing. There are consequences. If you don't fulfill those consequences, Madam Speaker, you will lose your license. It does not currently exist. That is what we're putting this in place for. This cry of excessive bureaucracy. I guess you had to find some sort of catchphrase to attack the legislation. A license procedure, a regulatory body must have some level of bureaucracy. Where is the excessive bureaucracy? Not a single example of what is excessive bureaucracy with this bill could have been provided. Just throw out the words, it sounds nice. You have to get a license. This is what you need to do to apply. This is what you need to provide. You get it, and you go on with your business. But you're going to be regulated. You have to account. Another point that was made was an attack on the chief executive officer. And what are the qualifications for the chief executive officer? So I immediately went to the bill. Clause 22. The board shall appoint a chief executive officer on such terms and conditions as it determines. That makes sense. 22.2. A person appointed as chief executive officer shall, and we set it out here. What are the qualifications? A, have at least 10 years experience in law enforcement or security. B, possess graduate qualifications in finance, marketing, or business administration. And C, have been positively vetted by the board. What better do you need for a CEO of this authority than what I've just set out? And what you're seeing here is amendments to the qualifications, So I want to put on record, Madam Speaker, through you, that means that at the Joint Select Committee stage, submissions were made by members. Those submissions were taken on board with respect to the qualifications or lack of qualifications, lack thereof, of the CEO, and it was amended, and that is what we're proposing here today. So why come here? Why come here now to try and mislead? I have it here. He was referring, now you see he has a style. He's just throw. Right? That is the member for Oropuch. He's making a set of noise now as usual. Because he's been shown to the population once again to be completely wrong. Right? The chief executive officer shall be responsible for the day-to-day administration of the authority and shall perform such functions as may be conferred on him by the board. So it is all captured there. The board shall appoint a suitably qualified person who is positively vetted. So for the first time in this industry, you're calling upon the persons who will be running the authority on a day-to-day basis to be positively vetted. That is a good step. That is a step in the right direction, Madam Speaker. Right? So what is the attack? Right? And as they go on, what you're then getting into with this, Madam Speaker, is that I wanted to spend some time on the security service operators. These are the firms that are now called upon to be licensed. And for the first time, out of these hundreds of firms that are currently registered, you're saying no. No person shall offer or provide security services as a security service operator unless A, it is a company, B, none of its directors was convicted of an indictable offense within the past 5 years, and C, it is the holder of an operator's license. And I want to point out to the population that here, once again, in the report that is before you, there are amendments made to the original bill in this instance. So it shows that once again, there was proper consultation, discussion, and that amendments were made. And I'd like to put onto the record, to support the member for Laventille West, we had extensive consultation with the stakeholders in the industry. They came and they sat before us in a joint select committee. They made their points. They sent in extensive written submissions. I wish we had a copy here today to show how extensive it was. And we listened to them. We listened to the industry. Now, they're going to be competing interests. Because what may be the interest of the employer, the owner of the firm, is not necessarily going to be in the best interest of the worker. But we listen to all. And you see some of the representatives here today because it affects them up in the public gallery, Madam Speaker, and I welcome them here today, and I'm happy to see them here. The Estate Police Association, because they know the hardships that some of their members face, injured on the job, no insurance to provide for them, so no status. I can say that there is a lot of anecdotal allegations that right now in the industry there are use of a lot of illegal immigrants, persons who don't have work permits. This legislation for the first time specifies that you could lose your license if you engage in that type of behavior. Why not tell the population that is what this is about? This is not, as the member for Laventille West said, this is not about P&M. There's no P&M security firm. I know that there was a UNC security firm. Mamu bought it. Yes. EBSL. Right? Criteria for an issuance of operator's license. And this is where we set out the 60 days. That you have 60 days to evaluate and to decide whether you're granting the license or not. But as I've said, Madam Speaker, the answer to that concern is that is one of the authorities' key and critical jobs and duties, and they will get it done. There's nothing else for them to be doing. They don't need to be checking the roadsides. They don't need to be inspecting police stations, etc. So the granting of licenses will be done in 60 days. And at 35(1), an operator's license shall be valid for 3 years. Completely commendable, necessary in my view, to keep the process of having them report to the authority going and to ensure that they continue to maintain the standards of their license. security officers is the next section I want to go to, Madam Speaker. Part 8 of the bill. And again,
Member for Port Spain North, St. Anne's West, your original speaking time is now spent. You're entitled to 15 more minutes to wind up your presentation. Yes, you may proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. So now we're getting to the protection of the security officers, who right now, as I said a short while ago, there is no requirement in law for them, unless they're going to be precepted to carry a firearm. So what we have are instances right now on unscrupulous security firms and companies hiring illegal immigrants, presumably exploiting them, minimum wage, maybe even less, because they will tell them you can't complain to the authorities because you're here illegally and you could be, right? You could be deported. But of course, charging for the provision of the service, industry standards. So all they're doing is increasing their margins at the exploitation of these people. So that is what this legislation is here. So we're saying you cannot hire those persons. That is not about loss of jobs. What you're now saying to the persons is go out there and get licensed. Make sure that you're not going to be exploited. Follow the law. This is for your protection. So it says at clause 43, an individual who wishes to offer or provide a security service listed in part 1 of Schedule 3, other than as a close protection officer. Again, I pause there, Madam Speaker. A great example of this legislation is it is for the first time recognizing that there are different services provided in private security service. So you may have a static guard, you may have a close protection officer who the public will know as a bodyguard, you have the peace enforcement officer, you have private investigators. So we've categorized for the first time the different categories of private security services being offered, and this is what you require. So they apply for the license. You should be not less than 18 years. You haven't been convicted on an indictable offense, nationally or internationally, and you have not been convicted of more than 3 years summary offenses within 10 years immediately preceding the date of the application. You can apply for the issuance of a security officer's license. And again, say within 60 days of receiving the application, you'd either be granted or not granted the license. So, of course, the reason, and again, I'll point out because the population can't see what it is we're looking at, this whole section of what is required as a preliminary qualification to become a security officer is amended. So again, that is a clear indication of the work of the committee, that when the bill was presented to the committee, there was discourse, there was discussion, and after consultation with the stakeholders as well, amendments were made along these lines, right? This is one of the important ones. So before, all it had said is an individual who has not been convicted of an indictable offense. So there were a whole category, because you see, you can elect, for some serious offenses, you can elect whether you want to have your matter heard summarily or indicted.
Just stating here. Thank you, Madam Chair. I see you have here 3 summary offenses within a 10-year period. You really think that you want somebody to run a security company with 3? Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm not now on who is running a security company. I'm now on who can be a security guard. So you don't want to just categorize, because a lot of the persons who perform these duties may have been convicted of certain summary offenses, obscene language, driving without a permit, driving without insurance, and we don't want to just make them unemployable now. So it is only for that category of workers. And again, we employ the same 3-year time frame here, Madam Speaker. So we're saying stay within the confines of the law, because within 3 years, you'll have to come back to get another license. If you've fallen on the wrong side, you're not going to be employable in this area. Special security officers, part 9. So for the first time, as I said a short while ago, Madam Speaker, we have categorized, because we're dealing with the pragmatic side now, that they are close protection officers, peace enforcement officers, or private investigators, and we are requiring them to have a special security officer's license. There are a whole series of people out there who hold themselves out now as private investigators, and they are not licensed. This is where we are trying to protect the public. There are also persons out there who hold themselves out as close protection officers. So they'll say, member for Caroni East, I will be your bodyguard. And he may be none the wiser. But what we're doing now is we're protecting you because we're saying they have to be licensed. They'll have to have a certain level of training to ensure that they don't go and fleece people out there. So, Madam Speaker, contrary to what we've heard previously, it is my submission that the work of your committee that was set up to carry out the examination of the bill did so. They did so after extensive consultation, not only with stakeholders, but also with others. They did so, and at those committee meetings, the chairman listened, we discussed, amendments were made where it was felt amendments should be made. And up to this point in time, I have not heard a single justifiable submission as to what further amendment is necessary. But I will say, because I've heard the conversation between the chairman and the Attorney General, that the government is not close to considering if anything justifiable and legitimate is put forward for amendments to this. But at the end of the day, this piece of legislation, which is long overdue, is all about protection and regulation of an industry that requires it. One of the other points that was made that should be responded to is the point that talks about things being tax-free. So what the authority is buying is being tax-free. And ironically, as I sat and I listened, I seen that sounded familiar. And it was when we were doing the public procurement legislation and we were in opposition. And we looked at that same clause. And we were saying, but you're creating this body, and as usual, why are we giving a body the opportunity to be tax-free? Will they abuse it, etc.? There is no piece of law, no piece of legislation that is passed that stops anyone from abusing it. Because by definition, the fact that people break law means that they don't necessarily respect the law. For the authority to get up, get off its feet, do what it needs to be done, it is felt by us as legislators that there is nothing abnormal, nothing unusual, and they can be granted the same facility. Is there going to be oversight? The answer is yes. Because at the end of the day, before they can spend money, they need to get the money. So there's a budgeting process, the national budgeting process that will give them subventions, their line items. It will be looked at how the money is expended. They will be audited. They will have to produce a report for the Minister of National Security. The Minister of National Security has the right and can always ask the Minister of Finance to send in the Central Audit Committee, as we have done as an administration. Time and time again, when there's any allegation, we believe that there may be misspending, etc. There is no need to worry or create a sense of panic that there's any lack of accountability. There's nothing unusual with this provision. So again, that is the response to that. So, Madam Speaker, in summary and in conclusion, I say there should be no justifiable fear in us getting on with what is long overdue. I heard it suggested by a previous speaker, it may have been the member for Urupuch East, that this industry is 50 years old in Trinidad. 50 years old, unregulated, exploiting potentially some of the most vulnerable in our society in their jobs and their job places. Now is the time for us to get on with it. There is nothing that is frightening in this piece of legislation, nothing of concern. But as I say, if we miss something, I haven't heard anything so far, we are prepared to listen, and it is not too late for amendments to be made in those circumstances. Madam Speaker, with those few words, I thank you.
Member for Point of Peer.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker, to join this debate. I just listened to and I know we're going to tea shortly. And I just listened to the member of Port of Spain, St. Anne's West, the Minister of National Security, and he looked up in the public gallery and he recognized the Estate Police Association, Madam Speaker. I want to ask the member if he read through the document submitted by the Estate Police Association and that was submitted to the GSC committee that we are discussing the report, Madam Speaker. It's like a 50-page document. And I just want to quote something because he talked about looking after the interests of the EPA. And I just want to quickly quote the opening page when they submitted their report to us. The EPA, this is the association, with great surprise, the bill was laid in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago for enactment into legislation on Monday, the 6th of May, 2019, by the Minister of the Ministry of Attorney General, Legal Affairs, the Honorable Fitzgerald Hinds. It goes on to say, Madam Speaker, on this occasion, it talks about the association. There's always been a collaborated effort between the government, whichever government is in power, and the association. But they go on to say, on this occasion, however, the association must state its dissatisfaction with the process currently being used to enact legislation to reform the security industry. The association was not consulted on the subject of security industry reform for the Private Security Industry Bill 2019 by the Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs, or invited by the Ministry to submit a response on the same subject, or sit in committee, or invited to discussions, or even made aware that the Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs was proposing to enact legislation to reform the industry. 9th of March, 2019, 9th of August, 2019, okay? So it's a 50-page document. I will go further into it because some of these statements that my colleague, the member for Oakwood East, was talking about, having an OSH member and so forth. When you go through this document from the EPA, a lot of the recommendations were the recommendations or concerns of the EPA that is right here in the public gallery, Madam Speaker. So it is disingenuous by the member for Port of Spain North, St. Anne's West, to say to this afternoon they are looking after the workers' rights and the EPA Association. And they never took the care to really go through this 50-plus page document. And this is where my member, the member for Oakwood East, was talking about that this is like when we were in our committee stage was wrong one, because we never had the opportunity to discuss workers' rights and the situations that would affect the workers that is associated with this private security industry, Madam Speaker. And so I'm a bit taken aback where the Minister of National Security is talking about looking after the rights of the workers and the exploitation of workers, Madam Speaker. And we created, I must say, we started good work in that committee. That committee was started back in, I think, based on the report, Madam Speaker, on the June 26, 2019. Madam Speaker, what is interesting, this afternoon when the member for Laventille West was piloting the bill, he referred to me as his good friend. And I said, you know, in my mind, that is trouble here this afternoon. Because if I wanted to go back to when we started up that committee back in 2019, Madam Speaker, and in some discussions with the member for Laventille West, who was the chairman of that committee, I asked him if he would do things differently in this committee. And he said, what would you like? I said, at the end of the report, whenever that final report is done, you would give the members on that committee a 7-day window to review the report before it is laid in Parliament so we can discuss it. Now, Madam Speaker, if you go to the minutes, of July the 3rd, Madam Speaker, matters arising, paragraph 5.3, Member Lee suggested and the committee agreed that the committee's final draft report will be circulated for consideration by members 7 days prior to laying same in Parliament. And, Madam Speaker, this is where I thought things would have been different in this committee, chaired by my friend, the member for Laventille West. Because I have sat down on several other committees, I'm a newcomer to the Parliament, and when I have the pleasure of sitting in a committee, the insurance, GSC, chaired by the member for Digger Martin Northeast, and his style was engaging. He gave the opportunity to the opposition to engage themselves in that committee and a fulsome report. And he always gave the opposition.
Honourable members, it is now 4:30. This sitting is suspended. We shall resume at 5 p.m.